I was 24 years old when I bought that rusted shipping container at an estate auction in rural Pennsylvania. My name is Jessica Morton, and I'd been working as a mechanic at my uncle's auto shop since I graduated high school. Everyone in town knew me as the girl who could fix anything with an engine, but what they didn't know was that I had bigger dreams than spending my life under the hoods of broken-down Chevys and Fords. The auction was held on a gray Saturday morning in October. The estate belonged to a man named Harold Brennan, a recluse who had passed away 3 months earlier with no living relatives. I'd heard stories about Harold my whole life. He'd been a military contractor back in the 70s and 80s, traveled all over the world, then came back to our small town and never left his property again. People said he was paranoid, that he'd seen things overseas that changed him. My mother always told me to stay away from his land when I was a kid. But I wasn't interested in Harold's story that morning. I was interested in finding cheap storage for the vintage motorcycle parts I'd been collecting. I had this idea, about starting my own custom bike shop. I'd been saving every penny for 3 years, learning everything I could about restoration and fabrication. The shipping container seemed perfect, rusted exterior and all. It was listed in the auction catalog as Item 73, described simply as 40-foot storage container, as is condition. The auction was crowded with dealers and bargain hunters. I recognized some faces from town, including Barry Hutchins, who owned the scrapyard on Route 29, and Margaret Chen, an antique dealer from Pittsburgh who showed up at every estate sale within 100 miles. But most of the crowd was interested in Harold's furniture, tools, and the vintage military memorabilia that filled his house. Nobody seemed to care about a rusty container sitting in the back corner of his 5-acre property. When Item 73 came up, I was the only one who raised my paddle. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Dennis Cooper, looked almost disappointed. He'd probably hoped for a bidding war. Instead, I got it for $300, which was exactly what I'd budgeted. I felt like I'd won the lottery. My best friend Rachel, who'd driven me to the auction, squeezed my arm and whispered that I was crazy for buying something I hadn't even inspected closely. She wasn't wrong. I'd only walked past the container once during the preview hour before the auction started. It was positioned behind an old barn, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and wild grapevines. The exterior was covered in rust and faded paint, with "Property of H. Brennan" stenciled on one side in white letters that had mostly peeled away. The double doors on one end were secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than the container itself. I tugged on the lock, but it held firm. I assumed Harold had used it for storing old junk, maybe some tools or equipment from his contracting days. After I paid and signed the paperwork, Dennis told me I had 2 weeks to remove the container from the property. The estate lawyer wanted everything cleared out before they listed the land for sale. I told him that wouldn't be a problem. I'd already arranged with my uncle to borrow his flatbed truck and some equipment. Rachel and I returned to Harold's property the following Tuesday with my Uncle Tom and his employee, a guy named Marcus Williams who'd worked at the shop for 15 years. It was one of those perfect autumn afternoons, cool and clear, with leaves falling from the oak trees that surrounded the property. The house itself was a sad sight, a 2-story Victorian that had once been beautiful but now sagged with neglect. The windows were dark and some were broken, and the wraparound porch looked like it might collapse at any moment. We drove the flatbed around to the back of the property, following tire tracks through the tall grass. When we reached the container, Uncle Tom let out a low whistle. Up close, it looked even worse than I remembered. The rust had eaten through in several places, creating holes the size of my fist. The roof had a pronounced sag in the middle, and I worried it might not survive the transport back to town. Marcus grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from the truck bed. The padlock was substantial, made of hardened steel, but Marcus was strong and the bolt cutters were professional grade. It took him several minutes of effort, his face turning red with exertion, but finally the shackle snapped with a loud crack that echoed across the empty fields. The sound startled a flock of crows from a nearby tree, and they circled overhead, cawing their displeasure. Uncle Tom reached for the handles on the right door while Marcus took the left. The hinges screamed in protest as they pulled. The doors had been closed for so long that they'd practically welded themselves shut with rust and corrosion. It took both men throwing their full weight into it before the doors finally gave way, swinging open with a metallic groan that made my teeth hurt. That's when the smell hit us. It wasn't the musty odor of old storage or the metallic scent of rust. It was something else, something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. Rachel immediately stepped back, covering her nose with her sleeve. Uncle Tom and Marcus exchanged a concerned glance, and for a moment I thought maybe we should just close it back up and call someone official. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and stepped closer to the opening, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness inside. The afternoon sun only penetrated a few feet into the container's interior, casting long shadows that made it hard to see clearly. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the inside. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The container wasn't filled with old junk or forgotten tools. The interior of that shipping container looked like something out of a spy movie. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, most of them still standing despite the rust and decay. On those shelves were dozens, maybe hundreds, of cardboard boxes, metal cases, and plastic bins. Many had deteriorated over the years, their contents spilling out onto the corrugated metal floor. But it was what I could see in those containers that made my heart race. Money, stacks and stacks of cash, some bound with rubber bands that had rotted away, leaving the bills in loose piles. Documents in waterproof sleeves. What looked like passports, dozens of them, scattered across one fallen shelf. And guns. At least 6 firearms that I could see from where I stood, along with boxes of ammunition and what might have been grenades, though I prayed I was wrong about that last part. Jesus Christ, Uncle Tom breathed beside me. He'd come up behind me to look, and his voice was barely a whisper. Jessica, we need to back away from this, right now. But I was already moving forward, unable to stop myself. I'd spent $300 on this container. I made plans for it. And now it turned out to be some kind of treasure trove or crime scene or both, and I needed to understand what I was looking at. My flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing more details. There were photographs tacked to the wall on the left side, dozens of them, showing places and people I didn't recognize. Middle Eastern buildings, Asian cities, African villages, and everywhere there was Harold Brennan, younger and harder looking than the old man I'd heard about, standing with groups of men I assumed were soldiers or contractors. Marcus had pulled out his own phone and was already dialing. "I'm calling the police," he said. "This is way beyond us. This is federal stuff, Jessica, military maybe. We shouldn't even be standing here." He was right, of course, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from what I was seeing. In the back corner of the container, partially hidden behind a toppled shelf, I could see a large trunk, the kind people used to take on ocean voyages. It was made of dark wood with metal reinforcements, and unlike everything else in the container, it looked like it had been maintained and protected from the elements. There was something about that trunk that drew my attention, something that whispered secrets and promises. "Don't touch anything," Uncle Tom said firmly, putting his hand on my shoulder. "Marcus is right. We document what we see, we call the authorities, and we step back. You bought the container, not whatever Harold left inside it. This isn't yours, Jessica." Rachel had joined us now, her curiosity overcoming her initial disgust at the smell. Within an hour, Harold Brennan's property was swarming with police. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, 2 patrol cars that came screaming up the dirt driveway with lights flashing. Then came the state police. Then, as afternoon faded toward evening, federal agents began arriving in dark SUVs with government plates. They cordoned off the entire area around the container with yellow crime scene tape and set up floodlights as the sun began to set. I sat in the back of Uncle Tom's truck with Rachel, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me even though it wasn't particularly cold. We'd been separated from Uncle Tom and Marcus, who were being questioned by different officers. A female FBI agent named Catherine Reeves had already interviewed me twice, asking the same questions over and over. How did I know Harold Brennan? I didn't. Had I ever been on his property before? No. Did I know what was in the container when I bought it? Of course not. Why did I buy it? For storage, for motorcycle parts, for my dreams of starting a business that now seemed impossibly naive and small compared to what was unfolding around me. Agent Reeves was in her early 40s, with short dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through every answer I gave. She wasn't unkind, but she was relentless. She wanted to know everything about my life, my finances, my relationships. She asked about my work at the auto shop, about my plans for the container, about whether I'd noticed anything unusual at the auction. I answered everything honestly, because what else could I do? I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd bought a storage container at a legal auction. The fact that it contained what looked like evidence of international crimes or espionage or whatever this was, that wasn't on me. You understand why we have to be thorough, Agent Reeves said during our second interview. We were sitting in her SUV where she'd brought me after the temperature started dropping. Harold Brennan was a person of interest in several investigations over the years. We'd lost track of him about 15 years ago. We knew he'd returned to the United States, but he'd gone to ground. No credit cards, no bank accounts, no internet presence. He lived completely off the grid. What did he do? I asked. I mean, people in town said he was a military contractor, but this seems like more than that. Agent Reeves studied me for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Harold Brennan worked for various agencies and private military corporations from 1974 to 1998. His specialty was asset acquisition and logistics in conflict zones. He had connections throughout the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. He was very good at moving things and people that weren't supposed to be moved. You mean he was a smuggler? I said. That's one word for it. They kept us there until almost midnight. By then, a mobile command center had been set up, essentially a large RV filled with computers and communications equipment. More agents had arrived, along with what looked like military personnel, though they weren't wearing uniforms with any identifying patches or insignia. The container itself had been photographed from every angle, and people in white protective suits were carefully removing items and cataloging them. I watched the process when they'd let me out of the SUV to use a portable bathroom they'd brought in. It was surreal, seeing this massive operation centered around something I'd bought for $300 just a week ago. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Part of me wanted to cry because I was scared and overwhelmed and didn't understand what was happening to my life. Mostly, I just felt numb. Agent Reeves finally told me I could go home around 11:30, but that I should expect more questions in the coming days. She handed me a card with her direct number and made me promise to call if I remembered anything else about the auction, about Harold Brennan, or about anyone who might have shown unusual interest in the container. She also made it very clear that I was not to speak to the press about any of this. There would be media attention, she warned. This was going to be a big story. A reclusive former contractor, a mysterious storage container, and who knew what kind of classified or illegal materials inside. The news would eat it up. Uncle Tom drove Rachel and me back to town in silence. His truck radio was tuned to the classic rock station he always listened to, but he'd turned the volume down so low it was barely audible. Marcus had left earlier in his own vehicle, probably grateful to be away from the whole situation. I couldn't blame him. This was supposed to be a simple job, helping me move a storage container. Instead, he'd ended up witnessing what might be the biggest criminal investigation our county had ever seen. When we pulled up to my apartment, a small one-bedroom place above the hardware store on Main Street, Uncle Tom finally spoke. "You okay, Jess?" I shrugged. "I don't know, I don't think it's really hit me yet. I keep thinking about what else might be in there. What if there's something really bad? What if people died because of whatever Harold was doing? That's not on you, Uncle Tom said firmly. You bought a container at an auction. You didn't know, nobody knew. The estate lawyer must have known something, Rachel interjected from the back seat. You don't just sell someone's property without looking through it first. And what about Dennis, the auctioneer? Didn't he walk the property? She had a point. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the interior of that container, the stacks of money and passports, the weapons, the photographs on the wall. I kept thinking about Harold Brennan, this man I'd never met but who now dominated my thoughts. What had he been? A patriot working for his country in the shadows, a mercenary willing to do anything for money, a criminal who'd somehow escaped justice for decades. Maybe all three, maybe none, maybe something I couldn't even imagine. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and made coffee. I sat at my small kitchen table, still wearing the clothes I'd worn to Harold's property, and opened my laptop. A quick search for Harold Brennan brought up surprisingly little. There was an obituary from the local paper, brief and uninformative. It listed no surviving family, no career details beyond retired contractor, and no cause of death beyond natural causes. The funeral had been handled by Henderson's funeral home in town, and he'd been cremated. There was no memorial service, no grave site, nothing to mark that he'd ever existed except a few lines in the newspaper and a property that was about to be sold. I tried searching for Harold Brennan military contractor and Harold Brennan asset acquisition, but nothing came up that seemed related to the man from our town. Either Agent Reeves had been lying to me about his background, which seemed unlikely, or Harold had been very good at keeping his professional life separate from his public identity. Or maybe his activities had been classified, buried in files that weren't accessible to regular internet searches. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was Rachel, can't sleep either. Have you seen the news? I hadn't. I quickly navigated to the website for our local TV station and saw the headline immediately. Federal investigation underway at rural estate. The article was short and vague, mentioning only that authorities were investigating materials of interest found on property belonging to a deceased resident. They didn't mention my name or the auction, but they did say the investigation involved multiple federal agencies and was ongoing. The comment section below the article was already filling up with speculation. People were saying it was drugs, or illegal weapons, or stolen art, or even buried bodies. Small towns love a mystery, and this was the biggest one we'd had in years. I texted Rachel back. Yeah, I saw it. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Do you think they'll give you the container back? She replied. I hadn't even thought about that. Legally, I supposed it was still mine. I had a receipt and a bill of sale from the auction, but morally, ethically, practically. The next morning, I went to work at the auto shop despite having had maybe 2 hours of sleep. Uncle Tom had suggested I take a few days off, but I needed the routine, needed to do something normal with my hands. The shop opened at 7, and I was there by 6:30, letting myself in with my key and starting the coffee maker in the small break room. The familiar smells of motor oil and brake fluid were comforting. This was my world, the place where I understood the rules and knew how to fix what was broken. By 8 o'clock, word had spread through town. Our first customer of the day, Mrs. Patricia Holland, who'd brought her Buick in for an oil change, spent 15 minutes trying to get information out of me. I deflected as politely as I could, citing the FBI's instructions not to discuss the case. This only made her more curious, of course, and by the time she left, I could see her on her phone in the parking lot, probably calling everyone she knew to report that Jessica Morton is involved in some kind of federal investigation. Uncle Tom arrived at 8:30 with a worried expression. Got a call this morning from Dennis Cooper, the auctioneer. He's getting heat from the estate lawyer. They're talking about voiding the sale, giving you your money back. Can they do that? I asked. I don't know, but Gerald Simmons, that's the lawyer handling Harold's estate, He's claiming they didn't know what was in the container. Says it wasn't properly inspected before the auction, and therefore the sale might not be valid. That's convenient, I said. Why didn't they inspect it before they listed it? Uncle Tom shrugged. Gerald's saying the padlock was too secure and Harold never left keys anywhere in the house. They figured it was empty or full of junk, not worth the effort of cutting it open. Now they're worried about liability. I poured myself another cup of coffee, my third of the morning, and leaned against the workbench. A 1987 Ford pickup was up on the lift behind me, waiting for me to replace its transmission. Simple, mechanical, fixable, unlike my current situation. So what do I do? Might want to talk to a lawyer yourself, Uncle Tom suggested. This could get complicated. Property rights, evidence in a federal investigation, potential claims from government agencies. It's above my pay grade, kiddo. He was right, of course, but lawyers cost money, and I'd been saving every penny for my business. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd bought a storage container to help start my custom bike shop, and now I might need to spend my savings on legal fees instead. The day dragged on. At lunch, I drove to the small office of Martin Kowalski, the only lawyer in town I knew personally. He'd handled my parents' will when they died in a car accident 6 years ago, and he'd been kind and professional during that difficult time. His office was on 2nd Street, above the insurance agency, a modest 2-room setup with dark wood furniture and law books lining the walls. Martin was in his 60s, with white hair and reading glasses that perpetually perched on the end of his nose. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Jessica," he finally said, "I'm going to be honest with you. This is outside my area of expertise. I handle wills, real estate closings, small business formations, that kind of thing. What you're describing potentially involves federal criminal law, property seizure statutes, possibly even national security issues. You need someone who specializes in this area." My heart sank. I don't know anyone like that, and I don't have the money for some big city lawyer. "Let me make some calls," Martin said. "I know some people in Pittsburgh who might be able to help. In the meantime, don't sign anything from the estate lawyer, don't talk to the media, and document everything. Every conversation with the FBI, every phone call, everything. And Jessica, be prepared for the possibility that you might not get that container. The government has pretty broad powers when it comes to seizing property connected to criminal activity." "But I didn't do anything criminal," I protested. "I know that, but the container and its contents are evidence now. Best case scenario, you eventually get the container back after the investigation concludes, which could take months or even years. Worst case, the government keeps it permanently and you're out your $300. Most likely scenario, something in between. Maybe you get the container but not the contents. Maybe you get compensated for your purchase. Maybe nothing. It's impossible to predict." I left his office feeling worse than when I'd arrived. The afternoon sun was bright, and Main Street was busy with people going about their normal lives. I felt disconnected from all of it, like I'd stumbled into a different reality where nothing made sense anymore. A shipping container. $300. That's all it had taken to turn my life upside down. My phone rang as I was walking back to my truck. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello." "Ms. Morton, this is Agent Reeves. Do you have a moment to talk?" Agent Reeves wanted to meet in person. She suggested the coffee shop on Main Street, neutral territory, somewhere public. I agreed and walked the 2 blocks from my truck, arriving before she did. I ordered a black coffee I didn't want and sat at a corner table where I could watch the door. She arrived 10 minutes later, dressed more casually than yesterday. Jeans, a simple blouse, a light jacket that probably concealed her weapon. She ordered something complicated with multiple shots of espresso and joined me at the table. For a moment we just sat there, 2 women in a small-town coffee shop, looking like we might be discussing anything: book club recommendations, workout routines. Instead, we were about to discuss whatever had been hidden in a shipping container for decades. "I want to show you something," Agent Reeves said, pulling an iPad from her bag. "But first, I need you to understand that what I'm about to share is part of an ongoing investigation. You can't discuss it with anyone. Not your uncle, not your friends, not a lawyer unless I clear it first. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I had any choice. The FBI doesn't really ask permission. She tapped the iPad screen and turned it toward me. It showed a photograph of money, stacks of bills arranged on what looked like a metal examination table. "We've counted approximately $340,000 in U.S. currency," she said. "Various denominations, various years. Some of it dates back to the 70s, some is more recent. All of it is genuine." My mouth went dry. $340,000. That was more money than I'd make in a decade working at the shop. "Where did it come from?" I managed to ask. "That's what we're trying to determine. But Jessica, here's the thing. Under federal law, specifically civil asset forfeiture statutes, the government can seize money and property connected to criminal activity. We believe this cash represents payment for illegal services Harold Brennan provided over the course of several decades, which means it's subject to seizure." "But I own the container," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew how naive they sounded. "You own a steel box," Agent Reeves corrected. "You don't own its contents, which were never properly inventoried as part of the estate. The executor should have opened the container before the auction. The fact that they didn't is actually working in your favor." "How is any of this in my favor?" She swiped to another image, this one showing documents spread across a table. "Because if the estate had properly disclosed the contents, the auction never would have happened. The property would have been immediately seized. But since you purchased the container in good faith, without knowledge of what was inside, you have a legitimate claim to ownership." "Let me cut through the legal complexity," Agent Reeves continued, swiping through more images on her iPad. "What I'm about to tell you could change your situation considerably, but it comes with strings attached." I leaned forward, my coffee forgotten. Behind us, the coffee shop hummed with afternoon activity. People ordering drinks, laptops clicking, the hiss of the espresso machine. Normal life continuing while mine hung in the balance. The Treasury Department, specifically the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has a program for situations like this. When substantial amounts of currency are recovered in circumstances involving a good faith purchaser, and when that purchaser cooperates fully with the investigation, there's a provision for compensation. "Compensation," I repeated. "The government recognizes that you made a legitimate purchase, and that seizing the container and its contents creates a burden on you. If you're willing to cooperate, to provide testimony if needed, to sign certain documents waiving future claims, you could be eligible for a finder's fee. It's typically 10 to 25% of the recovered asset's value." I did the math quickly in my head. 10% of $340,000 was $34,000. 25% was $85,000. Either amount would change my life. I could start my business. I could do more than just dream about it. "What kind of cooperation are we talking about?" I asked carefully. Agent Reeves closed the iPad's cover and met my eyes directly. "Full disclosure of anything you might have seen in the container, even if you think it's not important. Willingness to testify in federal court if charges are brought against anyone connected to Harold Brennan's activities. And most importantly, we need you to help us understand who else might know about the container." "What do you mean? Nobody knew about it except Harold." "Are you sure about that?" She pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and showed me a photograph. It was a still frame from what looked like security camera footage, showing a man in his 30s with dark hair and a beard, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. This man was photographed at the auction. He bid on several items from Harold's house, but not the container. He left before the container came up for bid. We've identified him as Ryan Brennan, Harold's nephew." "But the obituary said Harold had no living relatives," I said. "The obituary was wrong, or Harold wanted people to think he had no family. Ryan Brennan lives in Philadelphia, works as a financial consultant. We're looking into his background now, but here's what concerns us. Ryan knew about Harold. He knew enough to come to the auction." The revelation that Harold Brennan had a nephew who'd been at the auction changed everything. I tried to remember the day more clearly, to picture the crowd, and whether I'd noticed the man in Agent Reeves's photograph. But it had been a typical estate sale, dozens of people milling around, looking at items, making notes in their catalogs. I couldn't definitively say I'd seen him or that I hadn't. "Why would he bid on house items but not the container?" I asked. "If he knew what was inside it, wouldn't he want it?" "That's one of several possibilities we're considering," Agent Reeves said. "Maybe he didn't know what was inside. Maybe he knew but didn't want to draw attention to himself by bidding. Maybe he planned to approach you after the auction to buy it from you. Or maybe he was there for a completely innocent reason and were being overly suspicious." "But you don't think it's innocent?" "No," she admitted. "We don't. Harold Brennan spent the last 15 years of his life completely isolated. He had no phone, no internet, no contact with the outside world that we can trace. But someone had to know where he was. Someone had to know about his past. Ryan is the obvious connection." She pulled up another photo, this one showing a woman in her 40s with red hair, standing next to a silver Mercedes in what looked like a parking lot. "This is Diane Walters, Ryan's business partner. She was also at the auction. They drove there together in that Mercedes. Diane has no apparent connection to Harold Brennan, no family ties, no business relationships we can find. But she was there, and that's not a coincidence." I felt like I was being pulled into something much larger than a simple storage container purchase. "What do you want me to do?" "Right now, nothing. Go about your normal life, work at the shop. But if anyone contacts you about the container, anyone at all, you call me immediately. Don't have a conversation with them, don't agree to meet them, just call me." She wrote her number on a napkin and slid it across the table, even though she'd already given me her card yesterday. "And Jessica, be careful. We don't think you're in any danger, but Harold Brennan was involved with some serious people over the years. If any of them think you have access to something they want, that could change." The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. I looked around at the familiar faces, people I'd known my whole life, and wondered if any of them might be watching me. It was a paranoid thought, but Agent Reeves had planted the seed. Over the next 3 days, my life took on a surreal quality. I went to work, came home, avoided the media calls that had started coming to both my cell and the shop's main line. A reporter from Pittsburgh somehow got my number and left 6 voicemails before I blocked her. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the mystery container, with a blurry photo of Harold's property and a mention that a local resident had purchased the container at auction. They didn't use my name, but in a town of 4,000 people, everyone knew it was me. The gossip was relentless. I heard third-hand that I'd found millions of dollars, that I'd found stolen artwork, that I'd found evidence of murders, that Harold Brennan had been a spy, a terrorist, a drug dealer. Every story was more elaborate than the last, and none of them were accurate because I hadn't told anyone the truth. I'd followed Agent Reeves's instructions and stayed silent. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days after opening the container, Marcus pulled me aside at the shop. We were alone in the garage, both working on different vehicles, and he looked uncomfortable. "Jessica, I need to talk to you about something." I set down my wrench and gave him my full attention. Marcus wasn't the type to make conversation unless it was important. "What's up?" "Yesterday, after I left here, I stopped at the Gas and Go to fill up my truck. Guy came up to me at the pump, said he was a friend of Harold Brennan's from way back, asked me what we found in the container." My pulse quickened. What did he look like? "White guy, maybe 40, brown hair, wearing a suit. Said his name was Tom Richards. Told me he'd worked with Harold overseas and was sad to hear about his passing. Very friendly, very casual, but something felt off about him. Did you tell him anything? No, I said I was just helping move a storage container and didn't know anything about what was inside. He asked for your name, said he wanted to reach out and maybe buy the container from you if you were interested in selling. I didn't give him your information, told him I was just a hired hand. Marcus paused. But Jessica, he already knew who you were. He said your name before I even finished making up my excuse. He was testing me, seeing if I'd be honest. I pulled out my phone and called Agent Reeves. She answered on the second ring. Morton, what's wrong? Someone's asking questions. Approached one of the guys who was with me at the container. I put the phone on speaker so Marcus could repeat his story, which he did with more detail than before. Agent Reeves arrived at the shop within an hour, accompanied by another agent I hadn't met before, a tall man named David Foster who had the bearing of someone with military experience. They asked Marcus to repeat his story twice more, asking detailed questions about the man's appearance, his exact words, the vehicle he'd been driving. Marcus said he hadn't noticed a car specifically, but he thought the man had walked over from somewhere in the Gas and Go's parking lot. We need to see the security footage from that gas station, Agent Foster said to Reeves. If this guy is on camera, we can run facial recognition. Uncle Tom had joined us by this point, having heard the commotion from his office. What the hell is going on? Is Marcus in danger? Is Jessica? We don't know yet, Agent Reeves said honestly, but we're taking this seriously. Mr. Williams, I need you to come with us to give a formal statement. Ms. Morton, you too. And I think it's time we had a longer conversation about Harold Brennan and who might be interested in what was in that container. We ended up at the state police barracks 20 miles outside of town, in an interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner. Marcus went first, spending over an hour with Agent Foster going over every detail of his encounter. When it was my turn, Agent Reeves had more photos to show me. Different men, different faces, all apparently connected to Harold Brennan's past in one way or another. I'm going to level with you, she said after I'd looked through dozens of photos without recognizing anyone. Harold Brennan wasn't just a contractor. He was an asset for multiple intelligence agencies over a 30-year period. He moved weapons, transported people who needed to disappear, handled money that couldn't be traced through normal channels. He worked in some of the darkest corners of the Cold War and the conflicts that followed, and he made enemies. But he's been dead for months, I said. Why would anyone care now? Because his death became public. The obituary, the estate auction, these were the first times in 15 years that anyone outside this town had a way to find out what happened to him. We think people have been looking for Harold for a long time. People who want to know what he took when he disappeared. People who are owed money or favors. People who are afraid he left evidence behind that could incriminate them. I felt cold despite the stuffy warmth of the interview room, and they think I have this evidence now. The container is the obvious place to look, but Jessica, here's what you need to understand. Most of the people we're concerned about aren't going to hurt you. They're going to try to buy the container from you or its contents. They'll approach you with offers that seem too good to refuse, Agent Reeves continued. They'll be charming, professional. They'll have plausible stories about why they want what's in the container, family heirlooms, historical documents, personal effects they claim Harold promised them, and they'll offer you significant money. How much money are we talking about? I asked. More than the government's finder's fee. Probably a lot more.